There have always been many different types of slavery, and many people throughout history have been affected. The Chinese immigrants to the United States were no different. All came for a better life, and they expected to work for a wage, and the vast majority did. However, the experiences of the Chinese and other Asians varied greatly depending upon the work they did as well as their gender. Who were the coolies? What types of slavery were there for the Chinese and other Asians? How was enslavement still practiced decades after the Civil War emancipated all slaves?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former soldier, Marine Corps Scout Sniper, history professor, historian and book author, and we will answer these questions and other issues on this segment of Forgotten History.
The Chinese slaves in the United States, much like the Irish, has been largely misinterpreted or deliberately ignored as being a historical fact. According to historian Gordon Chang, official California records indicate that before 1848, there were only 54 Chinese immigrants living in the state. The California Gold Rush of 1848 changed this demographic, creating the first major wave of Chinese immigration, as well as people coming from all over the world into the state. These immigrants called the mountains of California Gamsan, which means in Mandarin, Gold Mountain. Chinese immigrants usually lived in small groups and were known to work the claims that other miners had abandoned. White residents were initially accepting of the Chinese since there were so few of them. However, after 1852, immigration rates greatly increased. Wars, famines, and disease in China increased immigration from China exponentially. In 1851, 2,716 immigrants arrived in California. Within 2 years, that number grew to 20,026 in 1853, making Chinese immigrants 20% of the population in Southern California's mining communities. In response, California instituted a $3 a month tax on the Chinese and coincided with increased violence against Chinese immigrants. In 1854, they were barred from giving testimony in courts, thus removed all penalties for crimes against Chinese, because even if the Chinese were victims, they could not testify in court. Since Chinese immigrants, and especially the labor force, were 90% male, many worked in mines and the railroads, earning the nickname of coolies. But many operated laundry services, provided childcare, sold food, and other professions. Part of this was the fact that female immigrants were nearly all sold as slaves to the brothels, from $300 to $3,000 apiece. This was the primary Chinese experience of slavery in the United States. Naturalist and writer Charles Frederick Holder wrote extensively on this problem in 1897, as it was still a thriving business in Chinese slavery in America. His research was incredible, and he also interviewed many of the participants years after the events. The Chinese women, mostly young girls, would be brought over by Chinese men, some of them family members, and they would be sold in a negotiated deal. The pimps and madams who bought them had them sign what the women believed were legal work contracts, although this was in fact sexual slavery. San Francisco had the largest slave market in the United States, and it was all about the sex trade. One such place was called the Queen's Room on DuPont Street, which was basically a public slave market for Oriental women. Around this time, the Chinese numbered around 20,000, with an estimated 1,500 being sex slaves, and another like number used as enforced domestic servants. Many of these girls did not arrive voluntarily, but were kidnapped in China and brought over to be sold. They were often forced with threats of death to sign customs and immigration declarations that they were legally married or had family in America. Many of these girls were promised to be married to wealthy men once they arrived in America, not knowing their true fates. These women easily passed through customs as mail-order brides, or in some cases, women were told to explain that they were returning to their husbands after visiting family back home. Some women were even brokered and sold on installment plans, like a home mortgage, with interest payments. Some women who fled sexual slavery were hunted down and killed so that they could not tell their stories. Chinese laws and customs made this easier for the kidnapper, because rarely did the bride and groom meet before marriage or even know each other before the ceremony, as most marriages were arranged. After the Civil War, when all forms of slavery were abolished, including enforced prostitution, these pimps and madams resorted to intimidation and, sometimes, violence and physical bondage to keep the money coming in. Even in areas where prostitution was illegal by any means, the Chinese and other Asian women were renamed domestic or comfort workers, and brothels became opium dens and massage parlors, in name only. Women who learned that slavery was now illegal and understood that they could not be owned often fled to sanctuaries, such as churches and law enforcement. Some ended up in court cases where their masters claimed they had service contracts and produced the documents. These actions by religious groups did not go unanswered, and criminal organizations, such as the Tong, would send teams to recapture these runaway women, often sending hatchet men to attack and kill the Americans who assisted these women. Also, after the Civil War, efforts were made to complete the Transcontinental Railroad, connecting the eastern and western coast of the United States. The railroad companies needed at least 4,000 men, yet they could hardly maintain a workforce above 800 due to the rather low pay and hard and dangerous labor required. At first, the Central Pacific Railroad's directors only wanted a white labor force. Leland Stanford, the railroad's president, had campaigned on keeping Asians out of California and restated his platform in his 1862 inaugural address as governor of California. Problems arose when not enough white men signed up, and as a result, the railroad began hiring Chinese men, but no women, for the backbreaking labor. Before companies hired the Chinese, the labor force was primarily Irish immigrants. Needing manpower, the railroad companies hired 50 Chinese laborers on a trial basis, believing that their race meant that they were incapable of completing the work. The work ethic of the 50 Chinese laborers was so impressive, they were nicknamed Celestials, in reference to the spiritual beliefs of the workers. Railroad companies, recognizing how punctual, disciplined, reliable, and well-behaved the Chinese workers were, wanted more of them. Stanford changed his opinion, as he told President Andrew Johnson that the Chinese were indispensable to building the railroad. They were quiet, peaceful, patient, industrious, and economical. In a stockholder report, Stanford described construction as a Herculean task and said it had been accomplished thanks to the Chinese, who made up 90% of the Central Pacific Railroad's labor force at that time, but they still needed more workers. As a recruiting method, they advertised in Chinese language newspapers. Despite their considered value, the Chinese monthly wage averaged between $27 to $30 a month. Irish workers each received about $35 a month. Over time, the Chinese workers were paid 30% to 50% less than their white counterparts, but were given the most dangerous work, and their death rates were far higher than among white workers. In June 1867, 3,000 Chinese railroad workers went on a strike, demanding equal wages, better working conditions, and shorter hours. This was the largest labor strike in American history up to that time. Now, the railroad did not fully agree, but they raised the Chinese workers' pay minimally, but the conditions remained unchanged. Part of this strike was due to the dangers of building the railroad through the high Sierra Mountains, where the Chinese were tasked with cutting through forest and building large retention walls, building trestles, filling in deep gorges, building wooden spanned bridges, and some of it in hostile Native American territory. Then after the severe Nevada mountains, the Chinese endured the heat of the Nevada and Utah deserts, yet exceeded all expectations. In order to prevent workers from escaping, they were sometimes chained together. As they approached the meeting point with the Union Pacific, thousands of workers laid down an incredible 10 miles of track in less than 24 hours, a record that has never been equaled. A Civil War officer who witnessed the drama declared that the Chinese were just like an army marching over the ground and leaving the track behind. However, the progress meant that Chinese died in greater numbers along the Central Pacific route. The company kept no official records of their deaths, but after the line was completed, Chinese civic organizations recovered around 1,200 bodies and sent them home to China for burial. Despite the great contributions made by the Chinese, attitudes changed, mainly through bigotry and the feeling that Chinese workers were taking American jobs for far lower wages. Anti-Chinese riots swept the country, and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 legally barred Chinese laborers from entering the United States and placed heavy restrictions on those already in residence. After slavery was abolished in the United States, Chinese laborers went to the South as cheap labor to replace freed blacks to work on the plantations. Many of the early Chinese came from sugar plantations in Cuba, and after the transcontinental railroad was completed, they also gave up labor. These laborers created their own enclaves in the southeastern United States, where they endured racist policies and were sometimes in conflict with the African American community. Due to the mass exodus of blacks from the labor force, or just the fact that they expected to be paid for their work, many Southern planters argued that blacks were unreliable and relieving. So they implemented black codes with labor provisions that would limit the ability of blacks to leave plantations and farms. Starting in 1865, a few Southern newspapers ran editorials and ads asking for Chinese labor, mainly from the accounts that Chinese workers enabled expansion of the Cuban agricultural imports, such as tobacco and sugar. Many Chinese responded, but they were basically treated the same as African Americans, but this migration took some time. In February 1866, the Commissioner of U.S. Immigration, R.S. Chilton, argued in his report to Congress that under the 1862 Act prohibiting coolie trade, importation of Chinese labor to the South should be prohibited and Southerners should instead work out contracts with the freed blacks. Chilton had classified the Chinese as involuntary immigrants, but the Southern states used a loophole to allow them inside their workforce, since they argued that the 8-year contracts in Cuba the Chinese had worked had expired and they were free to seek employment elsewhere. They needed workers, and the cheaper the better. In some cases, these Chinese workers, like blacks, who were technically free persons, were still kept on a farm or a plantation in a form of slavery for profit through force and intimidation. Even though federal laws applied, some state and local law enforcement officials turned a blind eye to the practice. Oftentimes, the local Ku Klux Klan assisted in this practice. This effect was even extended to the children of Chinese immigrants and their grandchildren, as federal immigration law prohibited Chinese citizens from becoming Americans until 1943.
We hope you enjoyed this segment of Forgotten History. Please click like and subscribe for free. And please stay tuned and be engaged and informed. Send us comments if you have questions or even show ideas, and we will respond to all requests and comments as soon as we can. Thank you.